Hello and welcome to Social Cognition, I think number 11, this time an application of many of the things that we've talked about before to consumer behavior. As you can see, the format is a little bit different this time around. That's because I'm feeling slightly under the weather and I really don't want to be on YouTube with a bit of a cold. I'm recording something for eternity, so there is no video of me talking today, but it's only a voiceover of the slides. And I'm sorry about that, and I hope you have some understanding. I can't do it better today. But we will still talk about consumer behavior as an application for social cognition research. What we will talk about specifically is this. We will take a quick glance at, first of all, what consumer behavior is about, and then specifically 3 effects that are pertinent to social cognition and are applied to consumer behavior then. And specifically, that'll be the endowment effect, it'll be context effects, and it'll be temporal discounting. And after that, so what we'll work up to is basically the understanding that, again, we run into troubles with people not being quite rational when they make decisions in the consumer context, which can actually be a problem, right? Because if you consume stuff that's not good for you, it's not healthy, for instance, then we might want to do something about it. We might want to help you make better decisions. And for this problem-solving perspective, we will introduce 2 ways how we can help people make better decisions. One of them being nudging, the other one being value-focused thinking. So before we get started, we have to do a little bit of definition work, of course. So what is consumer behavior about? Consumer behavior studies the processes involved in selecting, purchasing, evaluating, using, or disposing of goods and services, ideas, or experiences to satisfy needs and desires. So basically, this means that it is applied social cognition applied to anything that has to do with consumption. And of course, as with many discussions that we've had before in social cognition, we could ask ourselves, well, if our consumers were rational, what would our world look like? And perhaps it would look something like this. So this would be ways, for instance, that we would advertise Coca-Cola, let's say, or books and stationery. And if this is really still I mean, this is not what our advertisement looks like, right? So we are not under the impression that it doesn't matter how we present a product, right? We think, or there's a huge industry in advertising and marketing that thinks about how to present a product and how to make it appear more appealing to customers. Even though if we had rational consumers, that shouldn't matter, right? If consumers were rational, they should just buy products based off of whether they can actually use them and if they satisfy their preferences and their needs, and not based off of whether it's a brand that they think is cool or if the advertisement shows like some pretty people using the product or stuff like that, right? So if our rational consumers were indeed how real life consumption works, then we shouldn't see so much value placed on advertisement, because it wouldn't matter how a product is advertised for people's consumption decisions. What would matter for consumption decisions would be what the product is. If our consumers were rational, we would also have to assume that they have preferences that are consistent over time. In the sense that what I like to buy today is also what I will like to buy tomorrow. So I should not have any changes in taste. And if you think about your own purchasing history, I think you can tell that people do have changes in taste. So for instance, fashion is hugely dependent on the times that we live in. What people would wear in the 80s is perhaps now cool again, but in the 90s and 2000s, no one wanted to wear these clothes, right? So our preferences are not necessarily consistent over time. And this also often means that we're not great at pursuing long-term goals. So which one of you has a savings account where they actually every month put some money and try to profit off of long-term savings? Well, everyone kind of should be doing that because you actually make a profit, and you can correct for inflation, for instance, by collecting and just letting money sit and letting it grow. But pursuing these long-term goals is tricky for consumers because instead, I mean, we could just go, instead of putting $10 in the bank, well, we could just spend these $10 today on something fun like a really nice dinner, or like $10 to make our dinner nicer than it would be usually, right? So people are not rational in the sense that they don't necessarily pursue long-term goals, and they often discount future goals, and rather emphasize being satisfied and satisfying needs right now over assuming that they will also have needs later on. And finally, rational consumers would also be the kind of consumers that choose the best options given their individual tastes, right? But often when we make purchasing decisions, we can afterwards ask ourselves if we really made a good decision. And I mean, the whole discussion around, let's stick with fashion because I introduced this in the beginning, people buying clothing and then returning it is such a big upset in our society at the moment, because often these online retailers would even just trash the returns, right? But why in the first place would people have to return stuff if they just bought something that was also from the store? If you just bought something that you thought was nice, 2 weeks after, you should still think it's nice, and you shouldn't actually just change your mind at some point. So we would assume that if you were a rational decision maker, you would choose the best option. And then there's also no need for you to change your mind about it. Okay, so this is the rational consumer, but of course you know that this is not necessarily the case in real life. I've just given a couple of examples. And next up, I would like you to take a look at some real life consumers. So what I wanted you to do is to now go and take a look at the real life consumer. And for that, please pause this video and use the link I've provided to take a look at that video taken from Jimmy Kimmel Live, late night US TV show, where people are asked what they think about a new product, and they're asked to evaluate this product. And yeah, so pause now and then come back here. Okay, welcome back. So if you just watched this video, then you have an idea of the real life consumer. We are actually deeply impressed by things like brands and reputations and so on. And our preferences are not necessarily narrowly rational. So given that this is the real life consumer, we assume that decisions are actually shaped by social and socio-cognitive processes, right? And this may lead to irrational, or let's rather say suboptimal decision behavior. And what we want to do here is take a look at a couple of examples for these sort of suboptimal decisions in the context of consumer behavior. One of these examples is the so-called endowment effect, which deals with the idea that goods that you own are valued subjectively higher than goods that you don't own. So this means that if I'm a seller and I own a cup and I have to determine a price at which I'm willing to sell it, I will set a higher price than if I'm the buyer. As a buyer, I don't own a cup. I have to determine the price at which I'm willing to purchase it, and I'm going to say a lower price. So in a big study by Kahneman in 1990, the average price that actually consumers were willing to pay for a cup was $2.87, while the same cup was valued by the owners, the sellers, at an average price of $7.12. Why? Well, if you think back on our talk and our sort of on our lecture about loss aversion, you will remember that this is part of prospect theory, right? So people don't enjoy losing things, and losses actually loom larger than gains. So if you think about the S-shaped curve of matching subjective and objective value, you will remember that losses hurt, and giving up a cup that you own feels like a loss. So therefore, this is a good explanation for why people value things that they own more, and this is what we call the endowment effect. Now, please take a moment here to think about whether you can think of examples for the endowment effect in real life. So take a moment here and see if you can come up with examples. Okay, so now maybe you have some examples. Let me give you two to work with. Except for the price of the cup, which we already discussed. But another example would be that if we own, actually taken also from consumer behavior, if we own stocks, then we are not really good at selling them when they fall. So if there's a decrease in price and a decrease in the stock value, as you might see during a global crisis, then people are actually very reluctant to sell. And on the other hand, they are much more willing to buy something at a lower price. This would be one example. Another might be if we take a look at tax evasion. We see that the probability that people will evade taxes is higher when you already get the money first. First you get the money and then you have to pay taxes from it, compared to when you basically pay in advance on your taxes and you might get some money back. So once the money is on my account, then I feel reluctant to part with it. Therefore, I'm more willing, not me personally, but people are more willing to evade taxes compared to when they pay in advance and then they just get the money back that's not needed to cover the tax rate. Okay, so much for the endowment effect. Now let's take a look at another example of how sometimes consumer behavior is not quite rational. And this example deals with context effects. So effects of how the context in which purchasing options are embedded can change our preference for them. So let's get started with the decoy effect. And for this, we will have two pieces to compare. It's in the left table. So let's say we have two pizzas, A and B, and each of these pizzas have two features. So we have the price and the calories. And we'd like to optimally optimize price and calories such that the price should be low and calories should also be low. Because if you're in quarantine during home office time, you can't just afford munching tons of calories because you gotta be healthy and fit for when we get to go back outside. And price-wise, of course, you don't want to spend too much money on a pizza. So let's compare the two pizzas. We have pizza A that costs €5 and has only 500 calories, so it's expensive, but it's low on calorie count. And then we have pizza B that's €2 and it's high on calories. So it's cheap, but it's high on calorie count. So that means some people will prefer pizza A for the low calorie count, and some people will prefer pizza B for the lower price. So let's take a look at our table on the right side. Here, what you can see is that we've added to the pizza A and B a decoy pizza C to our menu that's available for purchase. So what is pizza C? Pizza C is expensive, so it has a price of €6 and it has a calorie count of 700, so it's not optimal in that regard either. So it's expensive and it has, compared to A at least, more calories. That means basically no one's going to want it. You can have fewer calories plus a lower price in A, right? Or you can have a lower price in B if you don't care about the calories. So that what we can observe is that now, if we add this pizza C, which we will call from here on the decoy pizza, we find that more people will choose pizza A, the target pizza that we as the store are trying to sell,
Why? Because pizza A dominates pizza C in all attributes. So it's both lower price and lower calories. And therefore, if we wanted to boost the sales of pizza A, our target pizza, then we could include pizza C in the menu as a decoy, and pizza B wouldn't get as many picks or purchases because as a comparison pizza, it only dominates pizza C in one attribute, which is the price. And it also dominates pizza A in that regard. So if we added our decoy pizza C, then in the right table where we have these three options compared to the left table, we would find more choices of pizza A. Yeah, exactly. So this is what we would call the decoy effect. The fact that an alternative that really no one wants, that's actually irrelevant, indeed changes people's preference for the other two options that were available all along. So we can also try to make our pizza B more attractive, and we could do that by adding a decoy that targets pizza B. So let's look at pizza D here. It's higher in price than pizza B, 3 euros instead of 2. And pizza D also, the decoy also has a higher calorie count, 2,000 calories compared to 1,500. So again, we've added a decoy that no one wants because you can have fewer calories plus a lower price in B compared to D, right? So no one wants D in this case. But also we won't see as many choices for A because you can have it only dominates in one regard. Pizza A only dominates in terms of the calories, but not in terms of the price. So here this means compared to the left table where we only have pizza A and B, we will see that in the right table where we have pizza A, B, and D, people are more likely to choose pizza B because B dominates D in both attributes. So this is the decoy effect, where adding an additional option changes preferences for the A and B options that were there all along. Another version of the context effect is the so-called compromise effect. And here, this is actually an example that you might encounter in a restaurant. If you see a wine list like the one on the left, you can see two types of wine, a Primitivo that costs €9.50 and a Shiraz that costs €7.50. They're actually kind of close, so one tastes a bit better but is a bit more expensive, and the other one tastes a bit worse but is a bit less expensive, right? So if you trade off, then people will have, they will just choose what they prefer. But now, if you take a look at the wine list on the right, what happens if we add one ridiculous expensive option to the wine list? Let's say we add a Barolo for €19.50. The price is, surely it tastes best. Who doesn't like a good Barolo? But it's also so much more expensive. This means that now many more people will settle for the middle option, the Primitivo for €9.50. So restaurants actually use this compromise effect to sell you their second most expensive wine. So if we compare the wine list on the right to the wine list on the left, we will see that the wine list on the right gets more choices of the Primitivo than the wine list on the left. So that means more often will people choose the €9.50 option. And in the end, of course, that means for the restaurant that they will make more money without even selling the really very expensive Barolo. Actually, sometimes restaurants use this trick to sell their most expensive wine at a price that's too high, just because it's actually quite reliable that people will pick the second most expensive. So all these context effects, no matter whether it's the decoy effect that I showed you with the pizza example or this wine list example, they basically constitute violations of rationality. Choices should be independent of irrelevant alternatives, but they aren't. And therefore, we've seen a second demonstration of how we have real-life decision makers in purchasing decisions and not rational decision makers. Now let's talk a little bit about temporal discounting. And here, what I'd like you to do is to pause this video and watch the mini movie about the marshmallow test, which I'm going to link to in the descriptions. Okay, welcome back. If you've watched this adorable video, then you will now know that we are going to talk about temporal discounting. Delaying gratification to get a bit bigger outcome is hard. And because we discount the effects on our future self, that means the present reward looms larger. Even though, well, technically, the reward in the future would be actually factually larger. So in this study, the original results showed that children who delayed gratification had better SAT scores later in life and other positive development outcomes. And this sort of suggested that temporal discounting is like this essential skill that as a kid you have to learn so that you will have great outcomes in life. I can sort of soften the idea for everyone who's now thinking of whether they would have had the patience to wait for the second marshmallow and maybe come up with the answer no, and now wondering if this means that they will have like bad life outcomes. I can soften that blow a little bit because the original study had 90 children who were all enrolled at the Stanford University preschool. So it's perhaps a pretty privileged sample of kids anyway. And a replication attempt with a much larger sample size, about 900 children, and a more diverse sample in terms of ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and so on, revealed that delayed gratification is driven by actually economic affluence and socioeconomic status of children's families, and not necessarily affects standardized test scores when controlling for this socioeconomic status. So there's a little bit of like a relief. If you're not good at temporal discounting, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will have bad outcomes in standardized testing. Actually, the bigger explanatory factor is still, and unfortunately so, socioeconomic status. But anyway, let's get back to temporal discounting. So let me show you another example of how people temporarily discount. So let's talk about gyms. Even though many gyms are closed at the moment due to COVID-19, in Germany actually this week gyms are allowed to reopen. And now we could use this as an opportunity to reflect on the average cost of gym memberships in a study from 2004 and 2006. De la Vigne and Montmendier actually asked participants how much they paid for their gym membership per month. On average, this was $75. And on average, they visited the gym 4 times per month. So if you do the math, that means a single visit, therefore, costs the gym members on average $19. But many gyms will also offer a pay-per-visit, like entry fee, and in this case, the average cost of pay-per-visit visits was actually only $10. So instead of being a member of the gym, it would have been cheaper to simply pay the pay-per-visit fee. And this is also an example of temporal discounting because people discount basically how much they think they will be able to resist the urge of just staying on their sofa at home. We also see this in terms of savings. And here's an example where 100 employees were asked how much money from their paycheck they save. And out of these, almost 70 saved too little money. Out of these 124 want to save more in the next 2 months, and actually only 3 do it. So this is more examples of how often we think that, or we behave as if rewards that are in the present are just better than potential future rewards. Even though if we just saved our money for a couple of months, we could buy something better, cooler, nicer, and so on with it. And we could also buy more because if you invest your money right, then it's going to grow a little bit. So discounting is being researched and studied. And a point of debate among researchers was what kind of a shape the discounting function has. What do I mean by discounting function? I mean plotting the value of a reward, the second marshmallow, if you will, across the time. So that the time, or rather the delay. So what we have here is on the x-axis the delay, either 0 delay getting the second marshmallow now, or after 1 unit of time, 2 units of time, 3 units of time, and so on. And then on the y-axis, we have the value of the reward, which can be either 1, it's the same as getting it now, or 0, it's nothing, worth nothing to you anymore. And now we can ask ourselves, what is over time, how does the value of our reward decay? And basically, what we would ask is, if I offered you the choice of either getting 100 euros today and 100 euros in a month, we can try to plot the choices in the sense of a value function. And the expectation of traditional models of economics was that we would see an exponential decay. That's plotted here in the, let's say, the purple color. But it seems like a hyperbolic discounting function, which is the pink one, actually is a better fit, such that we actually see a pretty steep drop of the perceived reward value very quickly, and then a rather slow decay over time. So now and in an hour matters and makes a big difference in how much I value a certain reward. But now compared to in an hour compared to in 5 hours, that doesn't make such a big difference anymore. Okay, so all of these examples, the endowment effect, our context effects, the temporal discounting effects, show us what we've known all along. And I'm just going to throw this back to a slide that we've used before already, that behavior is indeed not always rational. So people sometimes do stuff that is not in accordance with what a perfectly rational decision maker should do. Here is a quote that goes to show the same thing from Sunstein and Thaler. And they say that they can show that in many cases individuals make pretty bad decisions they would not have made if they had paid full attention and processed completely the information that was available, if they had unlimited cognitive abilities and complete self-control. So given that we assume indeed that it's not always rational what people do, and actually sometimes we just make really bad choices that we could have avoided, now what? Like, how can we do something to help people make better decisions? And this is what Sunstein and Thaler also wondered, and what they propose is nudging. So as a way to do some definition work, so a nudge, as we will use the term, is any aspect of the choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way. So that sounds pretty steep as a definition. So what I'd like you to do is to take a moment and pause this video, try to reformulate that definition so that you can understand it. Okay, let's take a look at this definition. So what does it mean? Every aspect of the choice architecture. Well, to get at the choice architecture, first we have to get a description of the choice problem and understand the procedure of making a choice in that specific problem, and also get a view of the contextual factors. So this means that all these three facets our nudge can exercise on. So our nudge can both work on the context and it can influence the procedure of making a choice. With a predictable effect, this means there must be a measurable effect on behavior of employing that nudge versus no nudge. And this also must mean that our effect is not random. And this also means that there is no effect on or expectation of rationality. What does that mean? The incentive structure itself remains unchanged. So the choice problem stays the same, and I'm not suddenly just offering you money to make the right choice, but I'm changing subtle things about the way that the choice is set up without changing what is the good thing or the right thing for me to do, such that my choice will be different. So this also means that the decision errors and biases that people show actually stay the same. And instead, we might say that nudges leverage these sometimes and produce a desirable behavior because of using decision errors and biases, or at least by taking them into account. So what I'd like you to do now is think a little bit about what the differences are between a nudge and an incentive, and try to come up with some examples. I think it would be nice if you actually pause the video and perhaps post it in the discussion on Canvas some information about what you think is the difference between a nudge and an incentive, and examples for this.
So we've discussed the idea that nudges are tools to make sure that decision makers are better off, right? And this idea that making a decision maker better off through using nudges is basically the goal of the philosophy that we would call libertarian paternalism. And we can take a look here as at a definition by Thaler and Sunstein, trying to explain what libertarian paternalism means. We use the term libertarian to modify the word paternalism, meaning liberty preserving. In our understanding, a policy is paternalistic if it tries to influence choices in a way that makes choosers better off. So the idea of libertarian paternalism and of nudging specifically is to produce a specific outcome, which is to make choosers or decision makers better off in the end. And it is paternalistic because someone, the state, or specific actors, the choice architects, if you will, are making decisions on what they think is the best outcome and are changing the choice architecture in order to get to that outcome. So in that sense, it is paternalistic, and they qualify this by saying, well, we only do this to preserve liberty, to make people better off in a way that's not interfering with them greatly by nudging only and not changing incentives. Right? And in that sense, it is liberty preserving because the choice problem itself is not changed, but only the architecture around it. So the problem with this approach, though, is to ask, well, who decides what better off means, and what are even the criteria for saying that someone is better off with making a specific choice? Does it apply to everyone? Is it about the decision maker specifically, or is it about making society better off? So we could consider the example of buying insurance. Some people are overconfident and they buy no insurance, and then that's bad for them. They could be nudged to do better. But other people already buy too much insurance because they're not overconfident, and nudging them to buy even more insurance would be bad for them, right? Because then they would be overinsured even further. But the system actually relies on overinsurance. That's how insured cases are financed, after all, right? In cases where insurance kicks in, are financed by the monthly fees that all insurers pay, even the ones who have no cases where insurance kicks in. So here it's difficult to understand who or what should be made better off. Should everyone be made to buy more insurance? That would benefit surely the insurance companies, but it might not benefit people who are already risk averse and already buy a lot of insurance without the nudge. Another example we could consider would be smoking. So most people know that smoking is bad, but some smokers then decide that they will want to smoke anyway. They discount the future effects of smoking and value the immediate reward of a cigarette more. if we assume that they therefore just reveal their preference to smoke now and just have adverse effects later, we can just assume that this is their preference. If you believe that this is a preference, well, then you shouldn't nudge people, right? Because this is what they want to do. But if you assume that they just make bad choices because they have a bias or whatever, then you might think that indeed you should nudge them to stop smoking and do it for their own benefit. But I hope this is a first glance at trying to discuss the question of whether libertarian paternalism is actually something that we should embrace. And I'll give you the task of discussing this in detail in a little bit by yourselves. So anyway, the idea of nudging is to make choosers better off. And let's take a look at how exactly this is done. Who came up with the ideas of nudging and who would later receive the Nobel Prize for it. So what I'd like you to do now is to pause this video and to go ahead and watch a video explanation by Richard Thaler about what nudging is about. So hear it from the inventor of the concept, basically. Pause this video now, go watch Thaler's introduction, and then come back here. Welcome back, and I hope that this was another way of explaining this helped you understand what the idea of a nudge is. We can take a look at some examples of nudges now so that we get a bit more of an in-depth idea of what nudge is about. So in this video, you remember that they spoke about Thaler and Sunstein talk about a curve in Chicago's Lakeshore Drive, where there's a visual illusion that nudges people to drive more slowly. Here's another example where road planners have painted these visual illusions of speed bumps onto a street. That's actually in Philadelphia. That also makes people slow down because they think that there is a speed bump there, but there's actually not. So why is this an example of nudging? Again, it relies on a change in the choice architecture without actual change in incentives. So the incentives stay the same. You can drive over this road without actually crashing into a speed bump and damaging your car. But the perception of the decision maker is a different one, which is that he or she should slow down because it appears as if there were speed bumps. So in that sense, this is a nudge. And actually, it's a really helpful nudge not only for people who would be speeding and therefore endangering themselves and others, but it's also a helpful nudge for the city budget because painting these nudges on these speed bumps on the street is of course much less expensive than putting actual speed bumps. And actual speed bumps, like physical speed bumps, would then also potentially damage some cars, so there would be downstream effects on people's wealth, which can be avoided if there's just a nudge painted on the street. Now, of course, the problem is that at some point this might wear off, right? If you just know that there is no speed bump there, then at some point people might just begin speeding over these speed bumps anyway, these drawn-on speed bumps. But it would still always work on people who don't know this route and would therefore also slow down traffic a little bit, right? Because if some people drive more slowly, then the others coming after them are kind of forced to drive more slowly as well. So this is one example of a nudge. Here is another one. This goes to show what we would call the default effect. And I have here 4 panels of data from donations. Let's say there's a website of a charity where you can choose to donate a specific amount of money. And in the form that you fill in to donate the amount of money, either there's no information or there's no pre-filled amount. This would be the graph on the top left, or there's an amount pre-filled there. So there's a suggested amount that already just is entered into the field, and you can erase it. It's no problem. There's no change to the actual incentives, but there is this kind of this nudge that if there's a 10 there already, there's $10 entered, or 20. This would be 10 is top right, 20 is bottom left, or even $50 bottom right. Then what we can observe is that people are much more likely to follow this default that's been entered than to change it and enter their own amount. So in the baseline, that's top left, where there's no amount pre-filled, there's no default set. You can see that it's a certain distribution of how much people donate. A bunch of people give 5, a bunch of people give 10, a bunch of people give 20, some give 50, and a few give 100. If we set a default of $10, then you can see a spike in $10 donations. If we see set a that's on the top right, if on the top left we set a default of $20 to be donated, then you can see a spike in these $20 donations. And bottom right, if we set a default of $50, then we can see a spike even there at the $50 donation level. So what we see here is a so-called default effect, that people tend to just follow defaults that have been set for them. Yep. So another example to illustrate what a nudge could look like is a nudge that plays into people's temporal discounting biases. So I don't know how many of you have thought about retirement. Among students, this seems to be rather a popular topic. But at some point in life, when you enter the workforce, you have to start thinking about it. And here, this is an example from the US, where there's no automatic savings for retirement, but you can join a retirement savings plan. It's called a 401k. If you join a company, then they can sign you up and they can help you save towards retirement. And in this study that I want to show you here, people were, once they entered the company, presented with different options, so different manipulations basically, regarding their 401k participation. So some people were at the beginning of their tenure in the company, so when they just joined, they were told that they were required to submit a form that said whether they were going to or not participate in the 401k savings within 30 days of their hire, regardless of whether they wanted to participate or not. So this would be an active choice paradigm. There would be an option or a manipulation where people are being told that they're enrolled by default. This is what we similar to what we just discussed in the donation case, so that there's a default set. The default is you are signed up. You can change this at any time, but there's a default there. Yes, so let's take a look at the data here. So on the top, you see the participation rate in the 401k savings plan after 1 year of tenure, so after 1 year of being hired. And on the top is the default, where just the regular thing that always happens in companies, how many people, it's kind of our baseline, how many people join the 401k in this case, 40%. We only have financial incentives, so it pays, of course, to be part in this retirement savings plan. That's why it exists. But there are no additional nudges. And in that case, in our baseline case, that's the gray bar, we see 40% of people joining. Now, if we offer our employees a quick enrollment option in the 401k, where they can just tick a box and then everything else works itself out, instead of filling a long form and then submitting it, but they can just on their employment contract tick a box that says, yep, sign me up for 401k, then we can already see that the enrollment increases to 50%. But more dramatically, compared to the baseline state, we can see that an active choice. So as I showed you on this slide before, when people are being hired, they are told they have to actively inform the company about their choice about joining 401k. This active choice increases participation in the program to 70%. So being told that you have to make a choice and you have to say whether you want to join or you don't want to join gets people up to 70%. Finally, default enrollment. So by default, you are enrolled and you can decide to opt out. this gets a 90% participation rate among the employees that were studied. So I think that's actually pretty interesting. That means nudging, in this case at least, can make a big difference in the degree to which people decide to plan for their future. And basically, this would be utilizing decision behavior that's not necessarily rational, because why, if there's a default, why should that change your behavior? It's not rational if it does, but actually we're banking on another type of bias to just follow defaults. To just follow defaults makes your decision outcome better if we assume that saving for retirement is actually better for people.
What I'd like you to do now is to look for other examples of nudges on the internet. Go ahead and Google your way through the entire internet and see if you can find real life examples of nudging in action that we haven't discussed so far. And if you find a cool one, I'd like you to post it in the discussion forum and also explain how it works so that your classmates can also benefit from this. So pause the video now, go ahead and look for 5 minutes on the internet for examples of nudges, and then just share the links and an explanation on the discussion forum. Finally, I'd like to actually involve you in a bit of a discussion about nudging and ask you whether you think that this is something that we should do. Do you think we should nudge people and gently shove them in the direction of making better choices, even though we don't change the incentive structure of the choice problem, but still we change the choice architecture as it's formulated in this discourse, and we make some changes so that people will be more likely to make the choice that we as a society, for instance, think is the better choice, the healthier choice, the one that leaves you with a lower probability of being impoverished when you're old, the choice that somehow is good for you in the end. Do you think that this should be done? And I would like you to discuss pros and cons about nudging and think about what you think about this. Make an argument about whether you think nudging is something that a society should do. This could go into it's an ethical question. So I would say there's no right or wrong answers here, but you can make arguments in both directions, and then in the end it's a question of beliefs and the values that you hold. So this, I think, is an interesting task for you to do and to think through in your mind. Take a moment and try to answer this question. Do you think we should be doing this? Okay, enough nudging for now. And let's look at another way how we can get people to make better choices. So here I want to introduce you to the idea of value-focused thinking. So this is an alternative, basically a very different approach to getting people to make better choices, to getting people to make less bad decisions, if you will. And this is what nudging set out to do, right? Nudging wants to help people make better choices, and value-focused thinking wants to do that too. But it does it in a different way. So value-focused thinking gets started with the question of what a typical decision looks like. A typical decision works like this. First, a problem occurs. Then we identify the existing alternatives, and only then do we evaluate the alternatives and make a choice. So we would call this alternative-focused thinking. It's basically backwards oriented, it's reactive, and it's kind of restricted, right? Because instead of doing what you think is important to yourself, you're just kind of reacting to what the environment is throwing at you. So what can you do instead? You can focus on values and try to be proactive in the way that you are thinking, such that when a problem occurs, it doesn't surprise you. And again, here, I want you to rather listen to someone explain this in a very good way, who is actually the person who came up with this idea of value-focused thinking. let's do basically a little guest lecture in this format where you get to listen to someone who's not me. A little guest lecture, which seemed to be quite popular to do. So please watch the video on value-focused thinking and decisions, skip to minute 5 and watch until minute 21. So don't watch the whole video, skip to minute 5 and then watch until minute 21. Have fun. So what is value-focused thinking about? Value-focused thinking basically produces 4 steps for the process of identifying our values. So the idea is that first we create an initial wish list where we include every value that we hope to achieve in a specific decision situation. And then we try to stimulate ourselves to create some additional values or to collect additional values by using mind-probing techniques and asking others. So basically this is like a brainstorming phase where you can see if you can go deeper or broader in terms of your values. Step 3 would be using each of the values already listed to search for missed values. So is there something close or very far away from this one that brings up another value that might be important to you after all? And then step 4, translate each of the values into a common format. This is the process of identifying values according to the value-focused thinking idea. And here I want to zoom in on step 2, ideas for stimulating additional values using so-called mind-probing techniques. What Keeney suggests would be thinking about alternatives to specific values that you've already formulated, consequences of the ones that you've already formulated, goals and constraints, just trying to choose a different perspective. So what would, I don't know, my mom say about this? Thinking about strategic values that you might have and generic values, and ask others for values that might be relevant. So these would be this would be part of the strategy for trying to find more values that matter to us. And in step 3, let's dive into this in a little bit more detail. Keeney would suggest that once you've listed all these values, you then try to search for more missed values based off of the ones that you already have. So for each one that you have, ask yourself, why do I care about this? What does this mean? And what is the general category of this value? And then perhaps you can find more that are adjacent to it. And I thought what was interesting was actually step number 4. Translating the values into a common format so that you. So last but not least, I'd like to take some time, or I'd like to ask you to take some time, maybe plan between 10 and 15 minutes for this, for an exercise that ties together the ideas of incentives, nudges, and value-focused thinking. So, and I want to make this a timely example, a timely exercise by asking you to think about interventions to increase compliance with hygiene rules during the COVID-19 pandemic. So in today's 1.5 meter society, how do we get people to comply with rules that help keeping other people safe and healthy, and that help with spreading the COVID-19 virus? You are by now, of course, experts on what the hygiene rules are, things like wearing a face mask, perhaps coughing into your arm, washing your hands, and so on and so forth. How can we increase compliance? And I'd like you to think about how compliance can be increased based on what you know from this lecture. So how could we increase compliance by changing incentives? So by changing monetary outcomes. How could you increase compliance by using nudges? And how could you increase compliance by encouraging value-focused thinking? So take some time and think about ways in which the goal of increasing compliance with COVID-19 hygiene rules could be achieved in these 3 routes. And I would say this should take you between 10 and 15 minutes. And I will, by the end of next week, post an example of how I would suggest to solve these questions. But that shouldn't discourage you from giving it a try yourselves. So before you read my solutions I'm going to post next week, of course that's not an authoritative answer, it's just a suggestion, there could be other ones. I'd like you to produce your own. So this is the final exercise. Please have some fun with it and try to apply the knowledge that you have now about incentives, nudges, and value-focused thinking. Okay. That was it. We've talked a little bit about consumer behavior. We've taken a quick glance at how people aren't in their everyday behavior, where they decide what to consume and how to consume it, necessarily rational. And then we went into problem-solving mode in taking a look at nudges and value-focused thinking, in the sense that this would allow us to help people still make better choices. That's it for this lecture. Again, I'm sorry that there was no video today. You can hear my voice not being great either. Sorry about that as well. And I hope that instead it's fun for you to do a bunch of things yourselves and actually do a lot of application work yourselves in this session. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, reach out via the discussion board to your fellow students, and have some fun with the exercises. Bye!